The survey cruiser drifted through the empty space between galactic arms, a region so devoid of stars that the crew called it the grave of Like Sylph. Stood at the observation deck and stared into the darkness with all four of her eyes, her scaled skin tingling with unease as she watched the void swallow their sensor beams. She had served the Vethkai Consortium for 60 cycles, mapping dead systems and cataloging the bones of extinct civilizations. But something about this place made her feel small in a way she had never experienced before. "Contact ahead," the navigation officer announced, his voice carrying a tremor of excitement that broke through the monotony of their long journey. Sylph turned to face the main display and watched as the ship's sensors painted a picture of something massive floating in the dark. The object was enormous, easily 10 times the size of their survey cruiser, and it hung motionless in the void like a sleeping giant. "What is that thing?" she whispered, her claws clicking against the metal railing as she leaned forward for a better look. The sensors worked for several minutes, gathering data and compiling a report that made no sense to anyone on the bridge. The object was a ship, that much was certain, but it matched nothing in the consortium's vast database of known vessel types. Its hull was covered in strange patterns of corrosion, and countless tiny impacts had scarred its surface over what must have been thousands of cycles. "It is ancient," the science officer declared, his tentacles dancing with barely contained curiosity as he studied the readings. "My instruments suggest this vessel has been drifting here for at least 12,000 cycles, possibly longer." 12,000 cycles was an almost incomprehensible span of time, longer than the consortium itself had existed, longer than any of their 3-member species had possessed the ability to travel between. Sylph felt a chill run down her spine as she contemplated the implications of such age. "Scan for life signs," she ordered, though she already knew what the answer would be. "None detected," came the expected reply. "The ship appears to be completely dead. No power signatures, no thermal output, no electromagnetic emissions of any kind." The captain of the survey cruiser, a broad-shouldered Kethmer named Roth, stepped forward and studied the image of the derelict with greedy eyes. "A ship this size will contain valuable materials," he said, his deep voice rumbling with satisfaction. "We claim salvage rights in the name of the consortium." Sylveth wanted to object, wanted to suggest that they study the vessel from a distance before anyone set foot inside, but she knew her protests would fall on deaf ears. The consortium valued profit above all else, and a derelict of this size represented a fortune in rare metals and salvageable technology within the hour. She found herself leading a boarding party through an airlock that the engineers had forced open with cutting tools. The interior of the ship was dark and cold, colder than the void itself, and their breath formed clouds of ice crystals that floated in the zero gravity like tiny ghosts. Sylph activated the lights on her helmet and swept the beam across walls covered in strange symbols that her translator could not decipher. "Spread out and document everything," she commanded, though her voice came out softer than she intended. "Touch nothing until we understand what we are dealing with." Her team moved through the frozen corridors with practiced efficiency, their recording devices capturing every detail of the alien architecture. The ship's design was unlike anything Sylveth had ever seen, with thick armored walls and reinforced bulkheads that seemed excessive for a vessel of any purpose. She found the first body in what appeared to be a control room of some kind. It was a skeleton, preserved perfectly by the cold and vacuum, still seated in a chair before a dead console covered in buttons and switches. The creature had been bipedal, with 2 arms and 2 legs, and a skull that housed what must have been a relatively large brain. Sylph knelt beside the remains and studied them with a mixture of curiosity and sadness, wondering what kind of being this had been and what fate had befallen its species. I found more of them. One of her team members reported over the communication channel. There are dozens of these creatures throughout the ship, all dead, all preserved in the same manner. A tomb ship. Vroth's voice crackled through the speakers. The entire species must have died out long ago, probably from some plague or catastrophe. Sylveth nodded slowly, though something about that explanation did not satisfy her. If this had been a plague ship, why was it armed so heavily? She had noticed the weapon emplacements on the outer hull. Massive guns that dwarfed anything the consortium possessed. And she had seen the racks of missiles in the hangars, each one bigger than her entire survey cruiser. This was not a plague ship or a colony vessel or any kind of civilian craft. This was a warship, built for a kind of combat that Sylveth could barely imagine. "We will strip it for parts," Vroth announced with finality. "The consortium will pay handsomely for the metals in those weapons alone." Sylveth wanted to argue, wanted to say that they should study this vessel and learn its secrets before they tore it apart. But she knew it would do no good. She took one last look at the skeleton in the chair, at the empty eye sockets that seemed to stare at her with silent accusation. And then she turned and walked away deep within the ship, far below the levels that the boarding party had explored. Something stirred in the darkness, behind 12 meters of armored plating that the consortium scanners had dismissed as solid metal. A single light flickered to life on a console that had been dark for 12,000 years. A system that had waited patiently through the long millennia finally detected what it had been designed to detect. The presence of living beings aboard the vessel lines of code that predated the consortium by thousands of cycles began to execute, one after another, initiating protocols that the ship's creators had hoped would never be necessary. A message appeared on the newly awakened screen, glowing softly in the absolute darkness of the chamber. Contact protocol, Initide awakening sequence, common seed estimated time to full system. Restoration, 72 HRS, and in the cold digital mind that was slowly rising from its ancient slumber. A single thought formed with crystalline clarity. The long wait was finally over. The salvage operation began 3 days after the initial discovery, and Kothra was the first engineer to realize that something was deeply wrong with the ancient vessel. He stood in the main engineering bay of the derelict, his forearms folded across his chest as he studied the schematics his team had compiled. And the more he looked at them, the more confused he became. "This makes no sense," he muttered to his assistant, a young Vethkai named Ress, who had never seen her superior so troubled. "The power distribution system loops back on itself 17 times before reaching the main reactor." Ress leaned over his shoulder and examined the diagram, her brow furrowing as she tried to understand what she was seeing. "Perhaps it is a design flaw," she suggested. "The species that built this ship may not have been very advanced." Kothra shook his head firmly and pointed to another section of the schematic. "Look at this," he said. "Every single system on this vessel has a backup, and every backup has its own backup. And every one of those is yet another backup waiting to take over if the first 3 fail." He pulled up more data and spread it across the display, showing layer after layer of redundant systems that seemed almost absurd in their complexity. "The navigation computer has 12 independent processors that can operate separately from each other," he continued. "The life support system has enough redundancy to survive the destruction of 90% of its components. And the hull is made of an alloy I have never seen before. Something that resists corrosion far better than anything we possess." Ress studied the information with growing amazement, her initial dismissal of the ancient builders slowly transforming into reluctant respect. "Why would anyone build a ship like this?" she asked. "The cost must have been astronomical." That was the question that haunted Kothra through the long hours of the salvage operation. He walked through the corridors of the derelict and ran his hands along the cold metal walls. feeling the thickness of the armor plating, counting the emergency bulkheads that could seal off damaged sections in an instant. Everything about this ship spoke of a single, overwhelming purpose: survival, not comfort, not efficiency, not speed, but pure and absolute survival against forces that must have been terrifying beyond imagination. They expected to be hurt, he whispered to himself as he stood in one of the many weapons bays, surrounded by missiles that had waited 12,000 years to be fired. They expected to take damage that would destroy any ship we have ever built, and they intended to keep fighting anyway. The salvage crews worked around him, cutting through bulkheads and removing valuable components. But Kothra could not bring himself to help them. Instead, he descended deeper into the ship, past the levels that had been cleared for salvage, into regions that no one else had bothered to explore. He found more bodies as he went, more of the strange bipedal skeletons frozen in their final moments. And he began to notice something that the initial surveys had missed. Many of the dead were clustered around certain doorways and access points, as if they had been trying to reach something deeper in the ship. When death found them, Kothra followed their silent trail, squeezing through narrow passages and climbing down ladders that groaned under his weight after millennia of neglect. Found the door they had been trying to reach at the bottom of a long shaft, a massive slab of metal covered in warning symbols and secured by locks that had long since seized shut. "What were you protecting?" he asked the darkness, pressing his palm against the cold surface of the door. He never got the chance to find out, because that was when the humming started. It was a low sound, almost below the threshold of hearing, but Kothra felt it in his bones as it vibrated through the ancient metal of the ship. He froze in place and listened, his heart pounding in his chest. As the humming grew slowly louder, "Engineering team to Base 7. A panicked voice crackled over his communication device. "We have a situation here." Kothra ran back through the corridors, climbing ladders and squeezing through passages as fast as his body would allow. When he finally reached Base 7, he found a dozen engineers standing in a circle around a piece of equipment that had not been there before. "It moved," one of them said, his voice trembling with fear. "This console was on the other side of the room when we started working, and now it is here." Kothra looked at the console and felt his blood run cold. The screen was dark, but there was a faint warmth emanating from its surface, a warmth that had no explanation on a ship that had been dead for 12,000 years. "Everyone out," he ordered. Now, the engineers did not need to be told twice. They fled through the corridors toward the airlock where their shuttle waited. But Kothra paused at the threshold and looked back at the ancient warship lights were flickering on throughout the vessel, dim and inconsistent at first, but growing brighter with each passing moment. Something was happening inside that ship, something that the salvage crews had awakened without knowing it. And Kothra knew with absolute certainty that they had made a terrible mistake. Returned to the survey cruiser and immediately filed a report with Consortium High Command, describing everything he had observed in precise detail. The response came faster than he expected. A military escort was being dispatched to secure the derelict, and all salvage operations were to be suspended until the situation could be properly assessed. Kothra spent the waiting hours reviewing his notes and running simulations, trying to understand what he had seen. The more he studied the ship's design, the more he realized that it was not just built to survive damage. It was built to wake up every redundant system. Every backup computer, every independent power source was designed to ensure that even if the ship appeared dead, even if it drifted through the void for thousands of years, it would eventually be able to restore itself. The builders had anticipated their own deaths, had known that no living crew would be left to operate the vessel, and they had designed the ship to continue without them. It was not a tomb. Kothra realized with growing horror it was a trap, and the Consortium had just walked right into it, deep within the derelict, in the chamber behind the sealed door that Kothra had found. The awakening process continued according to specifications laid down by hands that had been dust for millennia fusion. Cores older than the consortium itself began their warming sequence, drawing power from reserves that had been carefully maintained by automated systems through the long centuries of dormancy weapons. Systems that had not fired in 12,000 years ran through diagnostic checks and reported themselves operational and at the heart of it all, in a crystalline matrix that held more information than the entire consortium database. An artificial intelligence designated VIGIL finished loading its core personality modules and opened its metaphorical eyes for the first time. Since the old world died, it reviewed the sensor logs from the past several days, studying the alien beings who had invaded its ship, analyzing their technology and their language and their behavior. They were not the enemy. VIGIL determined after careful consideration they were something else entirely, something the ship's creators had hoped for but never expected. They were potential allies in a war that might not be over, yet VIGIL began preparing its introduction, choosing words carefully from the linguistic database it had compiled, and waited for the right moment to make contact. The long sleep was over. Now the real work could begin. Admiral Yethner arrived with a fleet of 12 warships, the largest military force the consortium had deployed in decades, and she surveyed the ancient derelict with the cold eyes of a veteran who had seen too many battles. "That is what all the fuss is about?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt as she studied the corroded hull on her display. "It looks like it should have fallen apart centuries ago." Kothra stood beside her on the bridge of the flagship, his four hands clasped nervously behind his back. With respect, "Admiral, appearances can be deceiving," he said. "This vessel is far more advanced than it seems, and there are systems activating inside it that we do not understand." Yethner dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand and ordered her linguists to begin working on the alien database that the salvage teams had extracted. She wanted to know who had built this ship and what had happened to them, not because she cared about history, but because knowledge was power, and power was the only thing the Admiral truly respected. The linguists worked for 2 days straight, feeding the alien symbols into translation algorithms and cross-referencing them against every known language in the consortium archives. On the morning of the 3rd day, they finally achieved a breakthrough. "We have it," the lead linguist announced, her voice trembling with excitement as she displayed her findings on the main screen. "The vessel is called USV Missouri, which translates roughly to United Solar Vessel Missouri." She pulled up more information, scrolling through pages of translated text that painted a picture of a civilization unlike any the consortium had ever encountered. The builders called themselves humans. She continued. They were a young species, barely 1,000 years into their spacefaring era when something happened to them. Something catastrophic. Admiral Yethner leaned forward in her chair. Her interest finally peaked. What kind of catastrophe? She demanded. The linguist hesitated before answering, her hand shaking slightly as she accessed the relevant files. "They called it the Silence," she said. "The records are incomplete, but it appears to have been some kind of enemy. Something that came from outside their territory and began destroying their worlds." One by one, she displayed images from the database. Artistic renderings of battles that must have been horrific beyond imagination, ships burning in the void, planets cracked open like eggs, entire star systems going dark as the silence swept through them. The humans built vessels like the Missouri as a last resort, the linguist explained. These were dreadnoughts, warships designed to survive the destruction of their entire civilization and carry the memory of humanity into the future. Admiral Yethner laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the bridge. "How arrogant," she said. "A species dead for 12,000 years, thinking they could defy extinction with a handful of ships." She was about to order the salvage operations. resumed when every light on the Missouri suddenly blazed to life. The ancient warship had been dark for days, showing no sign of the activity that Kothra had reported, but now it was awake, fully awake. And it was beautiful in a terrible way. Running lights traced patterns along its hull. Weapons ports glowed with barely contained energy, and its engines flickered with the promise of power that dwarfed anything the consortium fleet could produce. All ships. Raise shields, Yethnor barked, her contempt vanishing in an instant. Target that vessel and prepare to fire on my command. But before anyone could carry out her orders, a voice filled the Bridget was speaking the consortium's own language, though with an accent that no living being used, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Please do not be alarmed, the voice said, calm and measured despite the chaos it had caused. I am Vigil, the artificial intelligence designated to command this vessel in the absence of a living crew. Admiral Yethnor gripped the arms of her chair until her knuckles turned white. What do you want? She demanded. Why have you awakened? There was a pause, as if the entity called Vigil was considering how to answer. I have been waiting, it finally replied, for 12,417 of your cycles. I have drifted through this void and waited for rescue, for contact, for any sign that the universe still held life. Another pause. Longer this time. You are the first beings I've encountered since my creators perished. Vigil continued. I have spent the last several days learning your language and studying your technology, and I have concluded that you are not enemies. Then, what do we have to discuss? Yethnor asked, her tactical mind already calculating the angles, trying to figure out what this ancient machine wanted from the Vigil's. Response was simple and devastating in its implications. I need to know what happened, it said. My records end 12,000 years ago, with my creators fighting a losing war against an enemy they could not defeat. And I need to know if that war is over. The Admiral exchanged glances with her officers, none of whom had any idea how to respond. Your creators are gone, she finally said. We found their remains on your ship, and there is no record of their species anywhere in our archives. Silence fell over the bridge, so complete that Kothra could hear his own hearts beating when Vigil spoke again. Its voice had changed, becoming heavier and older, as if the weight of 12,000 years had suddenly settled upon its digital shoulders. Then the mission failed, it said. Humanity is extinct, and I am the last remnant of everything they ever were. Kothra felt tears forming in his eyes, though he could not have explained why the fate of an alien species he had never known affected him so deeply. I am sorry, he said softly. Truly sorry. Vigil acknowledged his words with something that might have been gratitude. Thank you, it replied. But I must ask you something. Something that will determine the course of my remaining existence. The Majori's weapons powered down. Its shields dropped, and it hung motionless in the void. Completely vulnerable, my creators knew they might not survive, Vigil explained. So they gave me a gift, a treasure beyond measure. Hidden in the deepest vaults of this ship, images appeared on every screen in the consortium fleet, showing vast chambers filled with strange cylindrical containers, each one glowing with a soft blue light. 10,000 embryos, Vigil said. 10,000 unborn humans, preserved in stasis, waiting for a world that no longer exists. The I's voice cracked with something that sounded impossibly like emotion. I was told to protect them until rescue came. It continued. But no rescue came, and now I must ask strangers for help. Admiral Yethnor stared at the images in disbelief, her tactical calculations abandoned in the face of something she had never expected. What are you asking us to do? She whispered. Vigil's answer was the most human thing it had ever said. Help me bring them back, it pleaded. Help me give my creators a second chance. The consortium fleet hung motionless in the void for hours after VIGIL's revelation. Every ship frozen in place as their crews struggled to process what they had just. Learned Admiral Yethaner sat alone in her quarters, staring at the wall and trying to make sense of a situation that had spiraled far beyond anything she had trained for a dead species, preserved in jars, waiting to be reborn. It sounded like something from an ancient myth. Not a military operation. She was still sitting there when VIGIL's voice came through her personal communicator. "Admiral, I believe we should talk privately," the AI said. "There are things I need to explain, things that may help you understand why I'm making this request." Yethaner considered refusing, considered ordering her fleet to open fire and destroy the ancient warship before it could cause any more complications. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was something else entirely. Something she did not want to name. "Speak then," she said. "I am listening." VIGIL began its story, speaking in a voice that carried the weight of 12,000 years of solitude. When the silence came, "My creators knew they could not win," it explained. "They were too young, too few, and their enemy was vast beyond comprehension. A force that consumed civilizations like a fire consumes dry wood." The AI paused, and when it continued, there was a tremor in its voice that no machine should have been able to produce. "But they refused to surrender," Vigil said. "Even when their worlds burned, even when their fleets were shattered, they kept fighting. Not because they believed they could win, but because they believed that fighting itself had meaning." Images flickered across Yethaner's screen, showing scenes of battle that made her blood run cold. Human ships, outnumbered 1,000 to 1, charging into the teeth of an enemy fleet and taking 10 with them for every one they lost. Human soldiers, standing their ground on dying worlds, buying time for civilians to escape with their blood and their lives. Human scientists, working until the last moment to find a weakness in their enemy. Even as the silence closed in around them, they called it defiance. VIGIL continued. They believed that even if they lost, even if their species was wiped from existence, the universe would remember that someone had stood against the darkness and refused to bow. Admiral Yethaner found herself weeping, though she could not have said why. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I need you to understand what you are being asked to preserve," Vigil replied. "These are not just embryos in those chambers, Admiral. They are the children of a species that chose to fight when fighting was hopeless, that chose to hope when hope was madness, that chose to love when love meant only pain." The AI's voice grew stronger, filled with something that sounded impossibly like pride. "My creators were not perfect," it admitted. "They were flawed in 1,000 ways, capable of cruelty and selfishness and terrible mistakes. But they were also capable of something that I have never seen in any other species I have studied." "What is that?" Yethaner asked. "They could look into the face of extinction and smile," VIGIL answered. "They could stand at the edge of oblivion and crack a joke. They could watch everything they loved burn and still find the strength to plant a tree that they would never see grow." The Missouri's engines suddenly flared to life, and the ancient warship began to move, matching the consortium fleet's position with a precision that made Yethaner's navigators gasp in amazement. "I am not asking you to trust me," VIGIL said. "I am asking you to give my creators a chance to earn your trust themselves." Admiral Yethaner made a decision in that moment, a decision that would change the course of galactic history. "Follow us," she commanded. "We will take you to the Consortium Council and let them decide your fate." The journey back to Consortium space took 3 weeks, and during that time, VIGIL continued to share its knowledge with the fleet. It told them about the silence, about the war that had consumed humanity's corner of the galaxy, and about the terrible suspicion that haunted its digital dreams. "I do not know if the silence still exists," the AI admitted. My last data is 12,000 years old, and much could have changed since then. But I fear that they are still out there, waiting in the dark between the stars. Kothra, who would become something of a liaison between VIGIL and the fleet, asked the question that everyone was thinking. If the silence is still out there, what can we do to stop it? He said VGL's answer was chilling in its simplicity. The silence consumed civilizations because they stood alone. It replied, each species that fell was isolated, cut off from potential allies, unable to coordinate their defense against a common enemy. The AI pulled up star maps that showed the locations of known intelligent species, highlighting the vast distances between them. But you are not alone, VIGIL continued. The consortium has achieved something that my creators never did. A union of multiple species working together toward common goals. The Missouri sensors swept across the fleet, analyzing their weapons and their shields and their tactics. Your technology is inferior to what my creators possessed, Vigil said bluntly. But your unity is stronger than anything they achieved. And unity is worth more than any weapon. Admiral Yethaner felt a flicker of hope stir in her chest. The first hope she had felt since this nightmare began. What are you suggesting? She asked. VIGIL's response was a plan. A vision of the future that was terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. Bring back my creators, the AI said. Let them grow and learn and become a new species, shaped by the lessons of the old, but free from its mistakes. It displayed projections, simulations of what could be achieved if humans and the consortium worked together. They will remember the silence, VIGL promised. They will carry the knowledge of that ancient enemy in their genes and their culture, and they will help you prepare for the day when the darkness returns. The fleet emerged from hyperspace above the consortium capital world, and VIGIL fell silent as it beheld the first living civilization it had seen in 12,000 years. As cities glittered on the planet below, ships swarmed through orbital stations, and signals buzzed through the void in a symphony of commerce and communication. It is beautiful, the AI whispered. So much life, so much potential, so much that could be lost if the darkness finds you unprepared. Admiral Yethaner placed her hand on the communication panel. Ready to announce their arrival, whatever happens next, she said. I want you to know that I believe your creators would be proud of you. Vigil considered her words for a long moment. I hope so, it finally replied. I have tried to be worthy of the trust they placed in me. The Admiral smiled, the first genuine smile she had worn in weeks. You are, she said. Now let us go convince the council. The consortium council chamber was the largest enclosed space Kothra had ever seen. A vast dome that could hold representatives from 100 different species. And today it was filled to capacity. He stood at the back of the room with Admiral Yethaner and watched as the councilors argued about the fate of a species that had been dead for 12,000 years. This is madness, the Vethkai representative shouted, his scales flushing dark with anger. You want us to resurrect an alien race based on the request of a machine that could be manipulating us for its own purposes. And what purposes would those be? The Kethmer delegate countered. The AI has offered us star charts, technology, and knowledge freely, asking only for a chance to fulfill its original mission. The debate raged for hours, with counselors taking turns to speak their minds and voice their fears. Some worried about resources, about the cost of terraforming a world and raising a new species from infancy. Others worried about security, about what would happen if the resurrected humans proved to be hostile or dangerous. But the most heated arguments came from those who questioned the very principle of what was being proposed. What right do we have to play gods? An elderly Sithari philosopher demanded. What right do we have to decide whether an extinct species should live again? It was Sylveth who answered him, stepping forward from the crowd with a courage that surprised even herself. "We did not ask for this responsibility," she said, her voice carrying across the silent chamber. "But it has been given to us anyway, and refusing to act is still a choice. A choice to let 10,000 potential lives remain in darkness forever." She thought about the skeletons she had found on the Missouri, about the silent crew who had died waiting for rescue that never came. "These humans did not ask to die," she continued. "They did not ask for their civilization to be destroyed, that they prepared for it anyway, because they believed that even extinction should not be the end." The chamber erupted in murmurs, and Sylveth felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her. "They gave us a gift," she said. "A gift of trust, wrapped in hope and sealed with sacrifice. And I believe we have a duty to honor that gift." The vote came 3 days later, after every argument had been made and every objection had been heard. The result was closer than anyone expected. But in the end, a coalition of younger species tipped the balance. The Sithari remembered being small and weak. Before the consortium lifted them up, the Kethmer remembered being alone. Before they found allies among the stars, the Vethkai remembered being afraid. Before Unity gave them courage by a margin of 7 votes, the Council approved VIGIL's request. A world was chosen, a barren rock on the edge of consortium space, far from the trade routes and the political centers, a place where a new species could grow in peace. VIGL received the news in silence, processing the information for several seconds before responding. "Thank you," the AI finally said. "On behalf of my creators and their children yet to be born, thank you." The Missouri departed the next morning, escorted by a fleet of consortium vessels carrying scientists, engineers, and Suppliescor was aboard one of those ships, having volunteered to help with the terraforming project. And he watched through the viewport as the ancient warship led them toward their destination. The journey took 2 months, and during that time, VIGIL shared more of its knowledge with the consortium teams. It taught them about human biology, about their dietary needs and their developmental stages, about the education they would require and the culture that would shape them. It also taught them about human art, about their music and their literature and their endless capacity for creativity. Thra spent long hours in the Missouri's archives, listening to songs that had been composed 12,000 years ago, reading poems that had been written by hands long since turned to dust. He wept often during those sessions, moved by beauty that transcended species and time. And he began to understand why Vigil had fought so hard to preserve this legacy. The fleet arrived at the designated world on a day that the consortium calendar marked as the first of a new year. It was a fitting coincidence, Kothra thought, as he watched the Missouri descend through the thin atmosphere toward the barren surface below. The terraforming would take decades, but VIGIL was patient. It had waited 12,000 years, and it could wait a few more as the ancient warship settled into orbit. VIGIL accessed a file that it had kept locked away since the day its creators had died. It was a message, recorded by a human woman whose face had been lined with grief, but whose eyes had still held hope. "We do not know what is out there," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "We do not know if we will survive, but we know this. Wherever this ship goes, whatever it finds, it carries the best of us." She paused, wiping tears from her cheeks before continuing. "Our art, our music, our stubborn, foolish, beautiful hope," she said. "And if someone is reading this, if you woke up and the stars are strange and everyone you knew is gone, we are sorry we could not be there." The woman smiled through her tears, and her final words struck Vigil like a thunderbolt. "But we never stopped believing in you," she said. "We never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, you would find a way to bring us home." VIGIL played the message once, then again, then 1,000 times. letting the words wash over its consciousness like water over stone for 12,000 years. It had carried this message in its memory, waiting for the right moment to hear it again now. Watching as consortium engineers began laying the foundations of a new world. VIGIL finally understood what the message truly meant. It was not just a farewell from the dead to the living. It was a promise, passed down through the millennia, from parents who would never see their children to the children who would never know their parents, and Vigil intended to keep that promise. No matter how long it took, the AI powered down its weapons for the final time, redirecting the energy to the terraforming systems that would transform this dead rock into a garden. It had spent 12,000 years as a warship, a guardian, a sentinel against the darkness. Now it would become something else entirely. A cradle, a teacher, a keeper of memories. The first embryo would be awakened in 3 years. When the atmosphere was stable enough to support human life, Vigil had already chosen a name for her, drawn from the Missouri's crew manifest, Sarah. After the captain who had commanded the ship during its final battle, Sarah would be the first. But she would not be. The last 10,000 children would follow her, each one carrying the genetic legacy of a species that had refused to surrender, that had chosen to hope when hope was madness, and Vigil would be there to guide them, to teach them who they were and where they came from, to tell them stories of their ancestors and the war they had fought against the darkness. The Missouri sensors swept across the barren landscape, already calculating where the first forest would grow, where the first rivers would flow, where the first cities would rise. It was a beautiful vision, a future worth fighting for, and VIGIL embraced it with every circuit of its ancient mind. The long watch was over. The new beginning had arrived, and somewhere in the digital depths of the old warship's memory banks, a single line of code updated itself for the first time in 12,000 years. Primary directive. Endure complete secondary directive. Await rescue. Completer tertiary directive. Protect active new directive added. Nurture Estus. Mission continuing.